What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Today, we have a wonderful episode for you. Joined with me today is Dr. John Speakman. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you.
It's my pleasure. I'm very excited to get into our topics of discussion. But before we do so, for the listeners who might not be familiar with you and your work, could you provide us with a background about yourself and your current research focus?
Yeah, sure. I'm a guy from the UK. I from the University of Aberdeen, and I was sort of going through the usual sort of track of an academic life, becoming more and more involved in admin. And 11 years ago, I kind of decided that wasn't the kind of route that I wanted to follow, that I really wanted to spend more time doing research. And of course, lots of people in academia say that, but they never do anything about it. So they just end up being, dean of college or whatever. Uh, but I decided to actually do something about it. So I applied for a job in China. And I actually opened up a second lab in Beijing 10 years ago. And I spend all my time doing research now. So I moved between the UK and China. And actually, in the last 6 months, I've moved from Beijing to Shenzhen in the south of China. And that's where I do my work. And my main interest is in energy. So basically, I'm interested in energy balance, energy coming in, energy going out. So I'm your classic sort of calories in, calories out guy. I know it's particularly unpopular at the moment, but actually, in my view, it's the only way to understand things. So that's what I work on. And it has several implications, one of which is obesity, of course, but also aging is influenced by energy balance. Most people will be aware of this idea of calorie restriction, and that if you eat fewer calories, you're going to live longer. So I've got a big research program that's looking at that, mostly in mice. And in humans, I've done lots, in the obesity field, I've done lots of stuff also in mice. But I've also worked on a whole range of different things in connection with energy balance. So we've measured energy demands of pandas, of cheetahs in Africa, and things like that. So I have a very broad portfolio, sort of jack of all trades, if you like.
Amazing. And for our discussion today, we're going to be primarily going over the evolution of body fatness. So, the obesity epidemic, it's at the front of all of our minds as practitioners and researchers within this field. How can it not be, right? So, to set the stage for this chat today, I want to open with a pretty broad question, and that is from an evolutionary perspective, as humans, why would we have this ability to become severely obese to the point where our physical function is compromised and these comorbidities arise, which ultimately are setting us up for an early death? Would there be any theoretical advantage to this? Why might this be, John?
Yeah, so I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. Obesity is obviously a detrimental trait, and yet it's got a big genetic component. So, evolution isn't supposed to work like that. Evolution isn't supposed to give you things that are bad for you. And people have recognized this for a long time. And so, over the last 70 years or so, people have come up with different ideas about why that might be. Why might it be that there's an obese trait that's driven by genetics? And the guy who came up with probably the best idea is a geneticist from the US called James Neal. And what James Neal produced was a thing called the thrifty gene hypothesis. And he published it in a little paper. It's only like three pages long in 1962. And it's been cited already maybe about 2,000, 3,000 times. And what he came up with is this very, very simple idea, but it's an idea that everybody can kind of understand. And what he said was that in our ancient past, food supply was always a problem. So there were always difficulties with food supply, and occasionally food supply would fail and there would be no food at all. And in those situations, we know that fat is a store of energy, that we can draw on. So what he said was, when the food supply failed and there was a famine, what happened was the people who stored fat were the ones who survived, and the people who were lean were the ones who died. And therefore, the genes, I should just precise this by saying, when I say genes for obesity, of course, there are no genes for obesity. Everybody has these genes. It's just there are variants in those genes that lead to deposition of body fat or deposition of less body fat. So when I say a gene for obesity, I don't mean the obese person has a gene and the lean person doesn't have a gene. Basically, they both have the same gene, but the variations in those genes are different. So I will just take that as read. When I talk about obese genes, I'm not saying that obese people have a set of genes that lean people don't have. They have the same genes, but they have some variance in those genes. Okay, so basically what Neil is saying is that when there's a famine, those variants get selected. And so basically then there's a predisposition to become obese. And what happens is you then take that system that's evolved over the last sort of 3-4 million years, and you embed that in modern society where there's tons of food available. And basically what happens is we have that predisposition to eat that food, to deposit the fat. And so the thrifty genes prepare us for a famine that never comes. And basically, we just get fatter and fatter waiting for this famine, but the famine never comes. And then what we end up with is an obesity epidemic. And it's an idea everybody can understand. So I think it became spectacularly popular for a couple of reasons. The first one is it's an easy to understand hypothesis. And, everybody can look at it, but it was actually produced in the 1960s. And the 1960s was a kind of interesting time for all sorts of reasons. But one reason in the sort of evolutionary field was that people were looking for evolutionary explanations for everything. And so basically, the fact that somebody could come up with an evolutionary explanation for obesity was something people wanted, something that people found really attractive. And so they took off as an idea and became spectacularly popular.
Absolutely. And to this day, I commonly see this hypothesis, whether they actually reference Neil or not. Most people will put forth that, yes, when it comes to the ability to become obese, we're going to store fat. We're efficient at doing so because it prepared us for these unforeseen stressors in previous times. But while this is attractive and it's simple, right? And part of that is what makes it so attractive. It's very easy to understand, but you've done some phenomenal work kind of teasing out the nuances of this and why there probably are a few shortcomings when it comes to this thrifty gene hypothesis. And this is where your idea, the drifty gene hypothesis, comes into play as kind of a solution which provides those finer details to really bring the point home. So could you outline that for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I should go through what the problems are with that sort of simple idea, and then we can get to a point where we kind of agree that we need another idea. Okay, so it's maybe worth thinking first about what's right about it. What's the sort of premises that are correct? So a premise that is correct is that uh, that's not immediately obvious. Actually, is that fat people would live longer if there was no food. Okay, and the reason that that's not entirely obvious is that actually, if you think about it just as like, okay, there's a heap of fat here and there's a smaller amount of fat here, and if we burn through it, we're going to burn through the smaller amount quicker than the larger amount. That seems obvious. But it turns out that fat people also store more lean tissue, and it's lean tissue where the metabolism is happening. And so actually, it's not completely obvious that the burn rate would be the same. So actually, the lean person is burning through the lower fat store at a slower rate than the fat person is. And so it could be the case that actually they would just die at the same point. So the question is, how do we test that? So the ideal way to do it would be to take a group of people and just starve them to death and see how long they live. So obviously no IRB is going to do that, but actually that experiment has been done. And it's been done in a kind of a way that you wouldn't expect. And that is because of hunger strikers. So actually, through time, there have been quite a lot of political protests where people have felt so annoyed about the subject, they've starved themselves to death. And actually, we have some records of the weights of those people. And we can see that most people who go on hunger strike, they die within about 30 to 50 days. Okay. Now, in the 1970s, there was a guy in China, actually a couple of doctors in Scotland, who decided that the only way to treat severely obese people was to starve them. And so basically what they did was they brought people into a hospital ward and they gave them no food. So they had no access to food. And for some of those experiments, the people were in those experiments for a year and they didn't die. They lost an awful lot of weight, but they didn't die. And so we know that obese people with a large amount of stored fat do live longer than lean people who don't store fat. And there's experimental evidence to prove that that is the case. So that starting out premise from the thrifty gene hypothesis is correct. But then it runs off the rails because there's nothing else that's correct. So unfortunately, the situation that's characterized is that, okay, there's a total failure in food supply and the fat people are surviving and the lean people are dying. Actually, there's no famine that ever happens that's like that. So the situation is there is always some food around. And if the food supply fails completely, people go and look for food. So they move out of an area and they try and find food in other places. So there's never a situation that the thrifty gene covers, where the food supply completely fails and people sit there burning through their fat stores waiting to die. That never ever happens. So what actually happens in a famine is that there's some food supply and the people who live are the people who can dominate that food supply. So basically, it turns out that there's absolutely no evidence from any famine that lean people survive and obese people die. We do have lots and lots of data, unfortunately, from real famines where real people die. And the people who die are the people who are weak and can't get the available food. And so basically, that's the very young. So that's people under 5 years of age have a massive mortality in famines. And people have a progressively increasing mortality as they get older. So basically, it's the very young and the very old who die in famines. It's not the lean people compared to the obese people. Now, that is a big problem for the thrifty gene hypothesis for two reasons. The first one is people under 5 generally don't differ so much in how obese they are. And so they die not in relation to any obese genes that they may be carrying. And the old people in the sort of 50s and 60s have already passed on all their genes. So they're no longer in the reproductive pool where selection can be differentially important. So basically, the selection, the mortality acts differentially on different people, but it has no relationship to the levels of obesity. So it can't be a driving force for selection of obese genes against lean genes. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, another thing, and this will kind of segue us into our next topic here. When it comes to the thrifty gene hypothesis, by this notion, within the current obesogenic environment, if these genes were to, automatically be expressed as we evolve, we would all be obese, right? To
Right, that's right. So that's kind of been known since the 1900s. So basically, there was a geneticist called Haldane, and what he did was a lot of modeling of selection on different traits. And what he showed was that you only need a very, very small advantage for a given variant for that variant to spread through the entire population. Now, it takes a long time, but of course, evolution's got a long time to work with. And it takes probably about, if you only have like a 0.5% advantage, then that is going to, through 6,000 selection events, that's going to spread through the entire population. So if this argument that, okay, there was massive selection going on for these obese gene variants, then everybody would get them. Everybody would be obese. And yet we know that's not true. If you look at all the data that's available, not just in the US, but throughout the world, actually the obese phenotype, although there are a lot of obese people, it's a rare phenotype. There's 600 million obese people from 7 billion people. So most people are not obese.
Excellent. Now this brings us to models of fat storage regulation, and
Sure.
a lot of my audience is interested in fitness specifically, right? So I have a lot of physique athletes and other mixed sport athletes who tune into this, and they're more or less vaguely familiar with these models in regard to set point theory and settling point theory, and
Sure.
I would like for you to kind of outline these approaches and then perhaps some of their shortcomings, because this will bring us to another great point that you made, kind of bringing more nuance and context to this conversation in terms of things that matter. But before we get into the theory that you've laid out, fill the listeners in on what exactly set point and settling point are.
Okay, so the set point theory was first advanced by a guy called Kennedy in the 1950s, and basically he called it the adipostat theory. And the idea is that we have like a system in our brains that control the level of fat in our bodies, a bit like a thermostat controls the temperature in a room. So basically, there's a control system and you have a set point of that system, like you can set the thermostat in your room to 23 degrees or whatever. And if you deviate from that, then systems are enabled, physiological systems are enabled to bring you back to that set point. So basically, what the kind of view of it is that, okay, let's imagine I have 20 kilos of fat in my body. Now I might intervene and try and reduce that amount of fat. So I could eat less food, I would draw my fat stores, that would reduce. I'd also draw a bit on my lean stores, of course, but in the end, the fat stores would actually come down. But what the sort of adipostat idea is that would bring into action a lot of physiology. So I would then start to feel super hungry because my stores were lower than this kind of set point. And what would happen is I would break my diet and I would start to eat more and more food until my stores gradually came back up and came back to this set point. Okay. And that's the downside of it, that it kind of explains why diets fail and why things go wrong when you try and lose weight. But the upside of it is that if I then go through the sort of holiday season, I go through Thanksgiving and of course, I wouldn't go through Thanksgiving, but you guys would go through Thanksgiving and eat an awful lot of food. And then you go through the sort of Christmas, New Year period and eat a lot more food. You're going to put on a lot of weight during that period, but then this physiology would then kick in again and say, well, okay, hold on a minute, you've eaten a bit too much here, your fat stores are too high, and that physiology would slowly over time bring you back down again. And so it's a kind of just like a thermostat. It regulates you around a set point. So the second idea is called a settling point. And this is a somewhat different idea. And the basic idea here is that there is some passive feedback. Okay, so what happens is, let's go through that scenario again where I weigh 20 kilos and then I go on a sort of calorie restricted diet and I start to lose weight. What would happen is I would not only lose fat tissue, but like I said, I would also lose a bit of lean tissue. And that lean tissue is where all the energy is being expended. So because I reduce my lean tissue, I would actually be spending less. So the deficit between what I eat and what I need would get less and less and less and less. So as I withdraw more and more lean tissue, eventually we would come to a point where what I was eating, even though I'd sort of eating the same as I was eating when I started the diet, that would now be just what I need to be in energy balance. And so the consequence of that would be is I would reach a new point to it, which would settle out the incoming energy against the energy that I'm spending. So there's a settling point. Okay, so it's not a sort of actively regulated system. It's just passively coming to a point where we're in balance again. And on the upside, so as long as I stay at that level of intake, I will stay at that level. Okay, and there's nothing driving me back up to this notional set point. But equally, what would happen if I went through the holiday season is I would go up in weight, but there would be nothing driving me down. So I would increase my expenditure because I would not only put on fat, but I would put on lean tissue. I would increase my expenditure until I meet a new settling point that's higher. And then I would just stay around about that kind of level. So the two ideas kind of explain the observations that people make, but they explain them in kind of completely different ways. And they're kind of ideas that have been picked up by different scientific communities. So the interesting thing is that the set point idea is really, really popular in the physiological world, the physiology of obesity world. They're kind of in love with the set point idea. And you see them talking about this idea in terms of things like leptin as a signaling molecule. So basically what they're saying is that there's this molecule that comes from fat that signals to our brain how much fat we have in our body, and that can then interact with the set point in the brain. And that's going to bring us back up to our set point, and that drives these hunger signals that bring us up. But it doesn't work on the other side. So basically, when you have more leptin, you don't lose body weight enormously. And so they have to make up this thing called leptin resistance, which basically says, actually, we do have a set point system, but it's just there's something goes wrong with it on the upside of the system. So they still kind of keep the notion of a set point, but they try and squeeze the data into it by creating this thing called leptin resistance. So like leptin resistance only exists in the heads of physiologists who believe in the set point. Yeah. On the other hand, if you look at the sort of public health people who work on obesity, they've completely bought into the settling point model. So as far as they're concerned, obesity is just a problem of the obese environment. So basically it's how many sodas you're exposed to, it's how much advertising you have, and there's no physiology going on at all. It's just how much your environment drives you to eat food, and that takes you to a new settling point, and that can be high or low or whatever according to what your environment is. So the two ideas are kind of fundamentally different, and they probably not explicitly supported by these different communities, but in effect, these different communities have bought into those two different ideas.
And both of these models have extremely compelling aspects of them. They both
Right.
have their strengths, but ultimately they're not complete. And I want to build off of some of the practical examples you provided there to really hone in on these weaknesses. And that is when it comes to set point, it makes sense in that. So if we consider the physique athletes listening in, right? So you diet for a bodybuilding show, you get super lean, and they will know that following this contest, they cannot maintain that level of leanness. They are extremely
Right.
hungry, and their body is forcing them to come back up to this set point, and that makes sense. But in the
Right.
case of the holidays and this gradual weight gain, from what I've seen in the research, when we look at the annual progressive weight gain over time in the average adult, a lot of this weight gain seems to take place over the holidays. So
Right.
if we look in the long term, it doesn't seem like people are, compensating and coming back down to that set point, right? So then
Right.
if we move on to the settling point, that makes sense in terms of the holidays. But in contrast, if we look at a bodybuilding show, settling point would mean that as you diet down, so there's extremely low body fat levels, you would just kind of settle in there and your physiology would adapt. But as you've outlined for us extremely well, these are some shortcomings of these models, which ultimately brings us to your dual intervention point model, which helps to
Sure.
fill in these gaps. So tell the listeners about this.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, I remember coming up with this idea, and I was really, really pleased with it. So basically, what happened was I was in a car park in the UK equivalent of Walmart. So basically, I was driving home with my wife, and she wanted to get something out of the store. So we stopped in the car park, and I was sitting in the car park, and I was thinking about these different models, and basically like you said, they both have merits. They both explain different parts of the phenomenon. So what I was thinking was, how is it possible to sort of combine the two ideas? And what I came up with was, what if instead of just having a set point as a single thing, actually it was two things? And so basically there was a lower intervention point and there's an upper intervention point. And so basically what could happen then is that all that sort of public health settling point stuff could happen between those 2 points. Okay, so there would be no physiology happening there. But if you went outside of those limits, then what would happen is this strong physiology would kick in and start to regulate. So the examples you've given are that if you take the bodybuilder who's preparing for a competition and loses lots of body fat, they would drop below this lower intervention point. So there would be really strong physiology going on there, pushing them back up into this sort of zone between the 2 points. But the person who's just put on a bit of weight in the holidays is still between the 2 points. So there's nothing happens. There's no physiology kicks in there to try and control what's going on with the system. And so that also explains this leptin resistance thing. Because basically what's likely is that leptin is a signal for that lower intervention point. But once your leptin starts to go up, it's not the signal at the upper intervention point. So basically, you don't need leptin resistance. You don't need leptin resistance to explain how leptin works. Leptin works because it's active at the lower intervention point, but it's not active at that upper intervention point. And actually, there was a really nice paper by a couple of guys from Denmark recently talking about that, about how one sort of unknown in the science of obesity is, what are the signals? What are the signals at that upper intervention point? But the problem is you have to buy into the model first. And I mean, there is a sort of increasing group of people that are buying into this dual intervention point model. But until people do that, then it's not a question in people's minds. If you don't believe there's an upper intervention point, why try and study what causes it?
Yeah, for
So I
sure.
was super pleased. Actually, I should just admit that I was super pleased that I came up with this, and I wrote it in a paper and everything. And actually, I'd met a guy called David Levitsky, and he gave me a paper that he'd published in like 2004 with the same idea in it. And so that wasn't so great because he'd already come up with it, and I hadn't found his paper because it was in a rather obscure book. And I was talking to him, and he said, "You know what? Actually, there's another couple of guys who came up with the same idea in 1984. So there's also a paper, it's in a book in a pretty obscure place, but it's also the same idea, this sort of upper and lower intervention point. So I can't claim that I'm the first person to come up with this, but I did come up with it independently, and I think it is a good idea. I think it's, the fact other people have come up with it actually strengthens it rather than makes it worse."
Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, I was not aware that there were, a few people before you who came up with this, especially in 1984. When we look at this model, especially if we focus in on the upper intervention point, so it would seem that this is increasing over time, and this is kind of related to predation risk, right? So as there's this lower risk of predators, right, where we live in this very safe, comfortable environment, so to speak, this has kind of been drifting up, right?
Well, no, okay. So actually, maybe what we should think about is what happens in wild animals first. So basically, wild animals seem to have this system. They seem to have a dual intervention point system, and the intervention points are pretty close together. So I mean, some people have interpreted it as effectively a set point, but the things are pretty close together. And so the question is, why do they have that? Why is that point there? And it seems that there are two different things going on. So basically, the lower intervention point is a kind of buffer against these sort of stress points. So basically, it's, you know, if food's unavailable for a short time, you've got a bit of a buffer that you could go against it. So you might say, well, okay, is that not just the thrifty gene idea? You know, it's the same kind of thing. So actually, it's kind of similar to the thrifty gene idea, but basically, it's not trying to explain why we get fat. It's just trying to explain why we are not super thin. So what that's basically saying is that the difference here is why normal body weight is a BMI of 20 to 25 and not 10 to 15. Okay, so you need a bit of fat in there to buffer you against these little stress points, and the lower intervention point makes sure you have enough of that. Okay, but that doesn't explain why some people go way up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in the animals, the reason that they don't go way up seems to be related to predation risk. So basically, you can do lots of manipulation. We've done some manipulations in the lab where we give small animals predator odors, or we play the noises of owls at them and things like that. And basically, they respond to that predation risk by lowering their body weight. So if they think there's an increased risk of predation, they lower their body weight. So it's like the intervention point has dropped them down. Okay. So we can imagine, let's go back 3 million years to Australopithecus in Africa. Okay. So that is a very different animal than what we are. So they're only about 30 to 35 kilos. They're quite small, solitary individuals. And at the same time in Africa, there's this enormous community of predatory animals. So there's like 8 species of saber-toothed cats. There's a specialized predator called Dinophilis that appears to predate specifically Australopithecines. There are, other giant cheetahs and things like that. So there are a lot of predators around. So it seems really likely that our ancestors had this same system. They probably had a system that stopped them from going too low in their body fat, but they also had an upper intervention point that stopped them going too high, because if they went too high, they'd have predation risk. Okay, so the question is, okay, why would anything change? Why would anything change between then and now? And what happened was, about 2 million years ago, when we were Homo erectus, we did several things. We discovered fire, we invented tools, and we became highly social. And these 3 things effectively allowed us to massively reduce the risk of predation. So we're no longer under a big threat of predation. What's going to happen with that system? Well, so this is a kind of a different way of thinking about evolution, because the way people normally think about evolution is adaptation and selection for things. But actually, what would happen in that situation is there's no selection. There's nothing happening, nothing selecting on this upper intervention point. So what would happen? So what would happen in that situation is the genes that control that would get random mutations. And over time, in different people, the position of that set point, that upper intervention point, would change. So some people would be lucky and they wouldn't have very many mutations and they would have a low upper intervention point. And some people would roll a different dice in the lottery. They would have lots of mutations and their intervention point would go way up. And that's why we see potentially a range of obesity levels across the population. Because when you go through that holiday, let's say you go through that Thanksgiving holiday, somebody with a low intervention, with a low upper intervention point, may go over that line. And then the physiology is going to kick in and it's going to bring them back down. But for most people, it's not. And so year on year, they're going to go in that point between until eventually they hit that upper intervention point and then they stop gaining weight. And that's an experience lots of people have, is that they don't put on weight forever. They put on weight, but then they come to a new level. And that's, of course, people then say, okay, that's my set point, or that's my settling point. But what I would say is that's your upper intervention point. You've drifted up there through this sort of time period. So we're mixing up sort of terms here. So there's drift in evolutionary time due to these genetic mutations, and there's drift in your body weight because there's no control going on between those 2 points. So because, I gave a talk at the Pennington Biomedical Research Institute in Louisiana on this, and there's a really smart guy there called Eric Ravison. And after my talk, we were having dinner, and he said, it's a pretty good idea what you had. It's never ever going to catch on. And I said, what do you mean? I was really pleased with this sort of idea of this drift in time. And he said, it's not got a good name. The other reason the thrifty gene hypothesis catches on is because it's got a good name, the thrifty gene. Everybody sort of can say it. And so that night, I was kind of lying in bed and I thought, it's all on drift. It's all about drift. So let's call it the drifty gene hypothesis. And I went to him the next day and said, I've got a name, I've got this name for it. Thinking he was going to say, yeah, that's great. And he went, nah, I don't like it. But anyway, I put it in a paper and it's kind of caught on a little bit. But, if I can promote that idea, then great. But basically, the idea is drift in the genetics. It's random mutations. It's not being selected over time. So the consequences for people in society are that some people stay lean and some people get fat. And it's just a lottery.
Yeah, I love this. When I was looking over your research and I was exposed to the specific theory that was the dual intervention point, it just made a lot of sense to me because I do see so many people talking about set point and settling point. And when I hear the way that they talk about it and I observe all of these notions surrounding these terms, it seemed like it wasn't exactly precise to what these terms actually meant. And to me, I felt they were more so referring to your dual intervention point model without specifically
Okay.
saying it. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you on and to really nail down these concepts for the listeners. You mentioned there in regard to the upper intervention point and the role of genetics, right? So
Sure.
how far up is this getting? And we've alluded to just the sheer importance of genetics in the development of obesity throughout this conversation. So for the listeners, if we look at the contribution of genetics to obesity, when we look at these genetic variants, and it seems we've identified a good handful of these at this point, what seems to be the prime players? So obviously there's a variety of genes. When we look at most of them that seem to be playing the most influential role, what are these gene variants doing? Are they making individuals more hungry, or they're less full following their meals? Perhaps there's increased metabolic efficiency. They're extracting more calories from this, or there's other changes in their proclivity for physical activity or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. What's really going on here? The main crux of the issue.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And actually, for most of these gene variants, we don't have the answer. But what I would say is that what they're probably doing is they're probably defining this upper intervention point. So basically, they're defining the point at which you intervene. So they're taking signals from the body and they kick into action at different times. So they're not necessarily driving your food intake or changing your appetite or doing anything in relation to your energy balance if you're between the 2 points. They may not be doing anything at all. It's only when you cross the limit that they become physiologically active and they start to do things. So I think that creates an issue with studying what the actual functionality of these genes are, because actually in most circumstances they may not be active, they may not be working in most cases. It's only when you go over the limit that they're then trying to control. So you need to sort of restrict the population that you look at to people who are kind of at their upper intervention point before you could get a real handle on what they were doing. What we can do about these genes is to say, well, okay, if that's correct, if these are things that are controlling that intervention point, we kind of believe that intervention point's in your brain. Okay, so it's unlikely that that control factor is in your liver or in your muscles or in your fat tissue. It's going to be in your brain because that's what's integrating the signals from your body to then say, okay, you need to stop eating. Yeah. So what we could do is we could look and see where those genes are expressed. So if you look at the genes that come out of the genome-wide association studies that say that they're linked to obesity, we can look at gene expression in different tissues and say, well, okay, what are the tissues where these genes express? And it turns out it's the brain. So the control of body weight appears to be a brain problem. Yeah, and that's completely consistent with these ideas that it's to do with something in your brain. It's not to do with, for example, another idea about regulation of body weight that's become quite popular is this idea that it's all to do with your body fat, and your body fat under the control of insulin soaks up calories that you eat, and that creates this kind of internal starvation state, which then drives you to eat more food. So this is the kind of carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. Now, if that was true, then you would expect that all the genes that are regulating this system, most of them would be located in fat because they would alter, how efficiently fat takes up the synthesized fat into the fat tissue. They should be really important genes, but actually they're not. They don't turn out to be the genes that come out of the genome-wide association studies. It's all the regulation in the brain.
When we look at obesity and these contributions of genetics and the environment, is it possible, based on the available evidence, to kind of put a number on things, or at least really be able to determine which one is playing a bigger role in in this crisis? Like, at practically speaking, right? I think many like to look at hunter-gatherer populations in the context of public health, and they'll think, well, these populations are physically fit, they have remarkable cardiometabolic health. Surely our genes couldn't have significantly evolved in such a short period of time. So what's the deal here? Why are they all lean? And then with the same genes, we're all becoming obese, and even more so over time. So when we look at these things, what seems to be playing the more predominant role?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and the answer to it is you can't put an absolute number on it because the number depends on the situation. So basically, if you have a situation where the environment is pretty constant, then most of the variance is going to be in the genetics, because that's the only thing that's different. Whereas if you compare people across enormous different environments, then most of the variance is going to sit in the environment. So the two comparisons that you've just made are exactly that different. So what you've said is, like, if we look at hunter-gatherer populations and modern humans, the genetics are not that different. And so in that situation, the main difference is the environment. The main reason why hunter-gatherers are lean is because of the different environment they live in relative to us. But if you look across people that are living in modern North America, the main difference is the genetics, because the environment is pretty similar. So the studies that have been done, twin studies and twin adoption studies and things like that, suggest that in the US, probably about 65 to 70% of the variance is due to genetics. So what we're saying is the difference between individuals is mostly down to genetics. So I can see already people, probably firing up and saying, hold on a minute, that can't possibly be true because our genetics has not changed since the 1960s. And yet, obesity rates have changed enormously since that. And that's absolutely true, but that's a different question. The change in obesity over time is a different question from what creates the variance between individuals at a given time point. And the 65% number is the variance between individuals at a given time point.
You recently posted like a little thought experiment on Twitter that I really enjoyed. So relating to these and this concept of obesity, and a lot of people like to put forth that it's a issue of willpower, right? And like
Uh-huh.
you just have to put the fork down, and they don't like to, or maybe they're just not even aware of the research on genetics. To be frank, and you said that when it comes to an obese person, if you are a lean person, consider this thought experiment, and that is, wake up, skip your usual breakfast, skip your lunch, and then around 5 p.m., reflect on your levels of hunger. You're going to be intensely hungry on this unusual eating schedule. And, like, more or less, that's kind of what someone with this genetic proclivity for obesity is dealing with on a daily basis. And it's not just a simple problem of willpower or lack of knowledge. And I just thought that was a beautiful illustration of these concepts.
Yeah, so that sort of analogy came from giving talks. So basically, I've given lots of talks on obesity, and inevitably, probably about 50% of the talks, somebody will say, "Is it not just willpower? Is it not just these people have no willpower, they can't control themselves, and that's really the problem." And generally, that's the person that says that is a thin guy. I don't know why it's a guy, but I probably have an idea why it's thin. And so basically, these people have kind of deluded themselves into thinking that the reason that they're thin is actually because they have this super willpower, and that if only other people were like them, then they the problem would be over. It's just a matter of people should be more like me and have a bit of willpower, and everything would be fine. And so what I wanted to do was like put those people in an obese person's shoes, and the big difference is this lack of the big difference in the physiology. So basically, the lean person has this physiology, it kicks in and it controls their body weight, but the obese person doesn't have that. And so they get driven up to these upper intervention points, at which point then this control level starts reasserting itself. But it's got nothing to do with willpower. Where your level is, it's just random genetics. It's not that you're some great person who can control yourself. It's just all genetics. And in fact, the evidence, if you look at, most obese people are trying really hard, and a lot of them have enormous willpower to overcome these drives. And so it's completely wrong. If anything, obese people show more willpower than lean people, because lean people don't have to show it.
Yeah, that's extremely well said, and I think it ties all of these concepts together extremely well. Wrapping up things here, John, I want to touch on sedentary behavior from an
Uh-huh.
evolutionary perspective. So, what is it that's so alluring about sedentary behavior, right? So, if we look back on these hunter-gatherer populations, right, they're extremely active. So obviously, when it comes down to the thick of things, us humans, we have the ability to be extremely physically active people. Despite that, and even furthermore, despite knowing all of the positive health benefits of physical activity, we are glued to the couch and Netflix if given the opportunity. So, from an evolutionary perspective, why is that?
Yeah, so actually, I wrote a short paper on this. Just maybe your sort of question stimulated by this little paper I wrote a couple of years back. So, and I was stimulated to think about this because every day when I walked out of my apartment, I walked past this phenomenon that was on the sort of ground in front of me. So basically, when I come out of my apartment, there are like two paths that intersect each other at 90 degrees, and people then have a choice. They can walk along the path, and then they can go either left or right, and on either side of this path the grass is worn down where people take a little shortcut. So they just cut off the corner and they just walk around. And I was thinking about, why do people do that? What is the benefit? Because you see it so many places and you see it in so many people. That's got to be kind of hardwired in our brains to take that shortcut whenever we can do it. And so actually, I kind of started reading a bit about it, and the sort of classic idea is that we're saving energy. So basically what we're doing is when we cut that corner, we're saving energy. And if we cut corners enough, we save enough energy that it becomes significant and this little selective pressure. So I did some calculations of how much energy you actually save by cutting the corner. And of course, it's completely trivial because, the difference between going across that corner this way and going to the end and turning is virtually nothing. But what is more significant is the time that you save. And so basically, if you do this, like if you do this 500 times a day, if you're a hunter-gatherer out walking and you cut these little corners, it reduces enormously the amount of time that you have to be out in the wild hunting for wild animals or doing whatever. And the important thing is that that time that you spend out is the time that you're also at risk of being predated. And so there might be strong pressure to try and minimize that time because that's the time when you're most at risk of dying. And so basically what I thought was that, okay, the reason that we're kind of hardwired not to go out and exercise is because somewhere deep in our brains, there's a kind of aversion to that because it's risky. So exercise is a kind of risky behavior, and sedentariness is a safe, it's nice, you feel comfortable, you're not at risk, and that's why it's attractive to do it, even though you know that it's potentially unhealthy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What are your thoughts in terms of promoting widespread increase in physical activity? So, in terms of improving public health and supporting this, is it are incentives enough, or like do we just need to reconfigure the built environment in such a way that it's just going to force people to not be able to cut corners in their everyday
Yeah,
life?
right. So I know in the US people are not keen on regulation, but
Yeah.
the thing is, people will do what they want to do. If you allow people to do what they want to do, they're going to do things that are not particularly good for them. And so you do need some regulation to try and change that behavior. So actually in Shenzhen, where I'm living at the moment, I'd actually visited here a couple of years before I moved here. And I went to a company called BGI. BGI may be sort of familiar to some of your listeners because it's the biggest sequencing company in the world. So they sequence more DNA and RNA than any other company. And I went to visit this company. It's a phenomenal place. I mean, they have this amazing, so the ambition of the company is to bring the mammoth back to life. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to clone a mammoth, and you'll be able to go to BGI and there'll be a mammoth wandering around on the site. So this is their kind of dream. This is where they're going into the future. But one thing about BGI is that they don't allow you to use the elevator in their building. So I had to give a talk on the 5th floor of this building. We had to take the stairs, 5 floors. So I sort of said to the woman, why don't we take the elevator? She said, it's not allowed. People who work in the company are not allowed to take the elevator. And, so that then forces you to do this, 5-story hike to give your talk, and then you do 5 stories down to go for lunch, and then 5 stories back up to the discussion room, and then 5 stories down before you can go home. And that's probably more climbing of stairs in that one day than I've done in the last 20 years. So I think if you force people, they will do it because they have to. And unfortunately, that's probably the solution.
I love that. Honestly, I couldn't agree more. I think something of that nature is just necessary. John, that's all the questions I have for you today. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I appreciate your time. For the listeners who want to go and learn more about you and support you, where can we point them towards?
Oh, good coach. I didn't realize you were going to say that. I have some papers here, and I guess probably it's difficult to point people into the scientific literature because generally a lot of these things are not easily accessible because they're behind these paywalls and you have to pay to get the information. Uh, I think probably the most easily accessible paper that you could read is the one about describing these different models, set points, settling points, and that was published in a journal called Disease Models and Mechanisms. So If people wanted to search on Google for that, if you just put my name and disease models and mechanisms, that's, I think, the only paper I've ever had in there. So it should come up and you should be able to sort of get some background. And then the other paper that probably summarizes all these ideas was a review paper that I wrote in Journal of Experimental Biology. So I've actually published a lot in Journal of Experimental Biology, but that paper is called The Evolution of Body Fatness. So if you put in my name, Evolution of Body Fatness, it should come up with that paper, and that really summarizes everything that we discussed today. So before you go, I'd just like to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to sort of air these ideas and let people know what I'm doing and some of the sort of problems with the sort of traditional ideas that are out there, like thrifty gene and set point, and maybe as people are typing things into Twitter and Facebook and whatever, they could just pause for thought when they start to write thrifty gene or set point and think, actually, maybe that's not correct.
I'll be sure to link up some of those papers in the show notes. I also
Great.
strongly encourage everyone to follow John on Twitter. Great stuff going on Twitter from you, John.
Okay, great. So I'm at John Speakman 4. So I don't
Excellent.
know where the 4 came from, but I think I tried at John Speakman and at John Speakman 1, and they were both already taken. So I just thought, okay, let's go for a bigger number. But actually, I should have chosen 8 because 8 is a lucky number in China, and 4 is like the worst number because the Chinese word for 4 is "se," which is also the word for death.
That's a fun fact. 4 is my favorite number. I did not know
Yeah, you
that.
need to change it to 6 or 8.
Maybe we'll have to rethink things on that. But everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time.
Thank you very much.